checking the, yes, it's being recorded. It's being recorded.
There we go. I just I answered your question there. Okay, ladies.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you for your patience.
Hello.
Nice to see you. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. We're just waiting for a couple of more people to join us. We anticipate a full house. I'm delighted to say both of our distinguished speakers are here. And if you could just bear with us for about another minute or two, and then we can get straight into it. Just while we are waiting, just to go through a couple of house rules, if you will, for those of you who haven't joined before. What we'll do is, because a number of you I'm sure will have questions, is we open up the chat facility, and within that chat facility you can also just raise your hand. I don't mean physically, but there is an option on Zoom to raise your hand if you have a question. Also in the chat, if you do have any questions, if you could perhaps indicate your media outlet and who you are, because I know some of you are maybe using various iPads with nicknames and all the rest of it. So that would be extremely useful. And post your question, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can in what we hope will be a lively and fast-paced briefing. So I'm just going to do that now and say hi everyone. Also, colleague Oliver Bradley was heard off stage saying this this briefing is recorded. It usually is available a couple of hours afterwards.
Alex, we need to wait a little bit more. A lot of journalists have issues with the connection, you know, so if we can have like 2 more minutes.
Yeah, I just sent all my journalists.
Many journalists have asked for the password.
Yeah.
So
I just sent all of mine a reminder of how to get in.
Apparently, it's not an issue our end. It's an issue on Zoom's end, as I understand.
It's an issue of all the criminals out there who require us to do all these thousands of authentications, unfortunately.
Okay, well, in any case, thank you for your patience. We currently have 31 participants. You're all very, very welcome.
There wouldn't be so many bad people out there, we wouldn't need passwords.
Oh, quite. And we're pleased to know during this briefing there will be no mention whatsoever of either Chris Rock or Mr. Will Smith. So this is a Will Smith and Chris Rock free zone. Mr. Yari as well, at some stage
Really,
during the briefing, we must touch upon Lebanon going bankrupt.
Hola. Sí, soy yo. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Sí.
c'est trompé, tiens, c'est pas vrai. Salut Bruno. Les joies de Zoom, oh là là, la vache.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, shalom, hello, buenas tardes.
I'm going to suggest we make a start.
Okay, we have 36 people in there.
Yes.
Let's start and hope that everybody else will be able to overcome the Zoom request for
Indeed.
Password.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining our EIPA press briefing today, entitled How Russia's Assault on Ukraine Could Reshape the Middle East. As you can imagine, the events in Ukraine have been harrowing to watch, and the ripples of what happens in Ukraine are obviously spreading around the world, no less towards Israel and indeed the wider Middle East. So with that, we thought it would be useful and beneficial for you all to bring in 2 leading experts on this subject. The first today is Mr. Ehud Yari, and the second is Mr. Bruno Tertre. Mr. Ehud Yari is an Arab-speaking leading expert on Middle Eastern affairs, a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's a Middle East commentator for Israel's Channel 2 television, the author of no less than 8 books on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and has quite rightly received numerous awards for journalism for his media coverage of the Middle East during the last 2 decades. Regular contributor to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and Atlantic Monthly. And following Mr. Ehud Yari will be Monsieur Bruno Tertre, joining us from Paris, who's the Deputy Director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. I hope I didn't mangle that, which is the Foundation for Strategic Research, which is a main leading French think tank on international security issues. He's a scientific advisor to the French government's High Commissioner for Planning, as well as a senior fellow at the Institut Montaigne. His areas of expertise include geopolitics and international relations, strategic and military affairs, nuclear deterrence and non-proliferation, I beg your pardon, US policy and transatlantic relations, security in the Middle East and in Asia. And he was previously a special assistant to the Director of Strategic Affairs at the Ministry of Defense and Director of Civilian Affairs Committee at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So I think we can agree, ladies and gentlemen, 2 distinguished experts. So let's just jump straight into it. Mr. Yari, what kind of effect can we see already or planned or looking into the looking glass of how the war in Ukraine and Russia's assault on Ukraine in particular, what the implications are for the Middle East, and can it have a reshaping effect?
Hello. Well, thank you. Hello, everybody. I was asked to be brief, and I will do my best to succeed in that. I think, number one, the amazingly poor performance of the Russian army in Ukraine is reverberating all over the Middle East. It's not just the poor military performance of the Russians, it's also the poor performance of their weapon systems. And this has led to quite interesting reactions by all the clients of Russian weapon systems, potential new clients of Russian weapon systems, generally. Although many of the Arab states were reluctant to openly denounce the invasion of Ukraine, everybody in the region that I know of and speak with are have second thoughts about the strength of Russia.
Excuse me, Ehud. Gentlemen, please mute yourself. Whoever, Leonard, if you can please mute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, and unmute yourself. Okay.
We'll see if we can do that. Shaked, if we can mute anyone, that would be extremely useful, other than the speakers. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
There we go, I'll just tell it. Mr. Yari, thank you for your patience. Please go on.
So I'm saying that Russian prestige has suffered a more enormous blow in the region, and I don't think it's going to prove very easy for them to regain their previous standing in the Middle East. I doubt it's going to happen. Point number 2 is that the Russian army has prepared for the Ukraine operation in Syria. They have tested in Syria no less than 320 new weapon systems, including their newest tank, the U-19, their best attack helicopters, the new ones, the Caliber cruise missiles, which they have fired from the Caspian Sea, etc., etc., etc. People in the region understand that Syria was very easy, relatively speaking, for the Russian army. there was no capable adversary confronting them. Different sorts of rebel militias, not armed with heavy weapons. And probably the Russians are paying a price, a heavy one, for relying on the military lessons that they have been drawing from Syria. They were in the process of transforming the army since the war in Georgia, in which they also didn't do very well. But it turned out that this modernization didn't really work, and people are aware of it. Just to remind people, in Syria, 90% of the pilots flying sorties in the Ukraine have done service in Syria, rotating every few months. 70,000 Russian soldiers, officers, NCOs served in Syria since September 2015. Most of the ground forces generals have either visited or spent time in Syria. So many Arabs, my friends, will tell you they are paying for what they have done in Syria. So we are seeing many of the Arabs distancing themselves from taking a clear-cut position, a pro-Western position on the war in the Ukraine, but at the same time maintaining a growing distance from Mr. Putin and Moscow. A word about Israel. Israel was led by both President Zelensky and President Putin to play a role, not of mediator, that was only in the mind of the Prime Minister, Mr. Bennett. Israel was called upon to play the role of an errands boy, and it did. But it's not going to play a role beyond that. What I see, especially in the Gulf, but also in Egypt and other places, is that many of the leaders and political thinkers are thinking again about China. What I mean is that they know that China is not coming to the region except as a trade partner, investors, etc., for the next decade or more. It's not going to have a fleet in the Western Indian Ocean for a long time, although the Chinese tried to get now and failed a base in Somalia on top of the base, the small base they have in Djibouti. But when countries like UAE will have to decide on major weapon systems, they will be taking a look at what the Chinese have to offer, especially in terms of fifth generation aircraft. The immediate impact of the war in the Ukraine is that it causes stalling of the nuclear negotiations in Vienna. I believe that at the bottom, the Russians are saying to the Americans, you want this deal, you are bending over in order to get a renewal, which is impossible, but a renewal, so to speak, of the 2015 deal. We have our price. We want exemption. We want Rosatom to be able to complete a $10 billion nuclear reactors deal with Iran. We want to be able to sell to Iran next year missiles, for example. It's going to be allowed according to the original JCPOA. So the deal is stalled. And the internal debate in Tehran is very interesting because you see a very clear divide between the radicals, the hardliners, supporting Russia all out, and what is called sometimes the reformists, expressing criticism of Russia. I believe doubts in Iran, as well as in the Arab world, are going to grow as to what extent they can rely and should rely on Russia. Another point I think I should make is Turkey. People tend to miss, that's my experience, people tend to miss the fact that there is a growing competition, rivalry between Turkey and Iran, the two non-Arab Muslim powers of the region. This rivalry manifests itself on many fronts, from the South Caucasus to northwestern Iraq, to northern Syria, to now to Lebanon, which is going to have general elections in May. And the Turks are trying to help the Sunnis regroup for the elections, while Iran and Hezbollah are trying to make sure they can take advantage of the political implosion of the Sunni leadership. The growing tension between Mr. Erdogan and the Russians over Ukraine is accelerating his search for new partnerships, systems of co-opetition, let's call it, with regional players, including Israel. So, for the first time now, after the terrorist attacks in some of Israel's cities, Mr. Erdogan has issued a strong condemnation. And he was doing that when he is still hosting the leadership and the operational headquarters of Hamas in Istanbul. He is trying to mend fences with Egypt. He has already done that with the UAE. He has made an enormous concession to the Saudis, agreeing to move the trial of the suspects in the murder of Mr. Khashoggi to Saudi Arabia. We are seeing the Turks moving in. And I'll probably conclude by saying that a new balance of power may be emerging now, with people realizing Russian relative weakness, with people impressed with the way the Americans dealt with the crisis and the effectiveness of the sanction system. Well, they think maybe the US has not withdrawn from the Middle East. Maybe it's not retreating as fast as everybody expected. And I believe the more we will see understandings between Turkey and United States, between Turkey and the local players, Arabs and Israel, we are going to see closer collaboration between the Arab Sunni states, Turkey, Israel, to try and block Iranian advances. I think, and this is my final comment, I think that the pillars for this hopefully new emerging system are two. One is the EastMed organization, which includes not only Israel, the PA, Egypt, etc., but also Cyprus, Greece, Italy. UAE is observer, and it is already acquiring a military dimension of sorts with joint drills, etc. And the second is the Red Sea Council, initiated by Saudi Arabia, also like the East Med based in Cairo, which is much more slowly, is also beginning to acquire some military dimension. Israel and the UAE are not part of it at the moment. I believe at a certain moment, we will see the signal so that they are brought in. And then we have a chain of sort of very loose alliances from the Eastern Mediterranean linked to NATO, to the other side of the Suez Canal, the sea lanes of the Red Sea, linking sometimes in the future, who knows, with whatever form the Quad will take there. Russia, I don't believe is going to be part of these new systems for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yari. Just before we jump in with Monsieur Tertre, my colleague Tal Rabina, who's our Director of Strategy here at Europe-Israel Press Association, as well as head of the Israel office, for those of you just joining us. Tal, you wanted to jump in with a couple of points.
Yeah, Ehud, it's very symbolic that you mentioned the United States only at the last part of your introduction, as if it was really the absent present. We know here in the Middle East that a lot of the solutions to be were based on some international assurances and international promises. What do you think the Russian-Ukrainian war might affect on the fact that Middle East leaders will take any international assurance ahead? Does it worth anything now?
Well, there is a lively discussion in the Arab press and the Iranian press in Farsi about the fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, 1,900 of them, sent everything back to Russia in return for a piece of paper in Budapest, which guaranteed Ukraine territorial integrity and independence. And we all know what happened already in 2014 in Crimea. So I believe that this kind of guarantees and written documents were never held in great esteem by all players in the Middle East, and certainly not now. It's, by the way, very worth noting that the Iranians are dealing a lot with this aspect, saying it wouldn't have happened unless the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear arsenal.
Thank you, Mr. Tetre. What would you reflect on that regarding the talks about the Iranian nuclear agreement in Vienna right now?
Hello. Yes, I will tackle most of the points that were tackled by the previous speakers, but with a slightly different angle, and I may have some nuances also. First of all, I'm not sure at all that the Ukraine war will reshape the Middle East. It's too early to say. It will have an impact. It's already having an impact. Reshaping is a bit too strong a word, I think, at this point. I think there are four different questions. One is indeed the Iranian nuclear negotiation. Another is the hard security problem, Russian military involvement in the Middle East. And the third is the food security problem, which we have not tackled. As many of you know, in this virtual room, it may very well have a political impact in detail. On the Iranian nuclear question, I do not believe that the Ukraine war is the question which is right now preventing the conclusion of a deal. It was the case a month ago, but my understanding is that it's no longer the case. What is definitely the obstacle is the question of the IRGC designation. And I strongly suspect that if the question of the IRGC designation were solved, a text could be agreed upon very quickly. Now, and one of the impacts of the Ukraine war on the negotiation, potentially, if they were to resume, is the fact that when the Europeans look at the coming weeks and months and years, their potential need for Iranian oil and gas is certainly more important than it was 2 months ago. So whether this will actually have an impact on the way they approach a possible continuation of the negotiations remains to be open. But that's a factual assessment of how the Europeans see the potential impact of a deal in the coming years. The food security problem has not been tackled yet. Egypt and Libya, on average, rely for about 80% on Russia and Ukraine for wheat and other cereals. So even though the Egyptian government has taken measures already, I think it's very difficult to imagine that there will not be a social and therefore political impact in the coming weeks. Recall that it was because of a particularly bad drought in Russia, as well as fires, etc., that exactly 10 years ago, the hunger riots, or rather the inflation riots, as I call them, hunger riots do not exist. If you're really hungry, you do not riot. But the inflation riots actually were a critical parameter in the political evolution of Egypt 10 years ago. Then the hard security problem is as follows: how much will the continuation of the Ukraine war, and it will continue, for at least weeks, months, I don't know, but certainly weeks. What will it mean for future Russian involvement in the region, in particular, in as much as Russian mercenaries may be withdrawn from the Middle East and Africa to fight in Ukraine, as it's already happening to some extent. And then again, as the previous speaker said, what will it mean for the credibility of Russia as a security guarantor? Russia had managed to successfully present itself as a hard security guarantor in Syria. I think that Middle East leaders will look twice before calling Russia on the phone if they need it in the future. Bear in mind, however, that Russia has not given up on the Middle East. One sees that in as much as RT, the Russian network, has been suspended in Europe, it's actually doubling down on its efforts to influence African and to some extent Middle Eastern opinion. Then we have 3 questions. One has been tackled upon by the previous speaker, which is Turkey. So as I see it from Europe, is Turkey back in the fold? My answer would be yes, certainly, but for how long, we don't know. There are all the signs, in particular in NATO and Brussels, are here that Turkey has decided to not only, in effect, take sides in favor of Ukraine, but also has been toning down its rhetoric on many of the contentious issues that they've had with the US and with us Europeans. The big question, however, remains, will that hold? How much will Mr. Erdogan continue in that direction as the 2023 elections approach? So I would issue a very cautious and guarded yes to the question: is Turkey back in the fold? We don't know what it will be in a year from now. What we know is that Mr. Erdogan's behavior over the past 10 years has been erratic enough that we should not take it for granted that it is now firmly back in the Western fold. The second question: will Western allies in the region take sides. Obviously, as many of you know, they don't want to take sides. Obviously, there's a lot of Russian financial interest in some countries. We've seen the Russian money flowing in the United Arab Emirates, etc. I think it will depend a lot on how much Russia is actually weakened at the end of the conflict. For now, the most probable scenario is that Russia will be definitely weakened and appear weakened in the end, but we may still have surprises. And of course, their position on Russia also depends on the way they see Russia as a competitor in the oil and gas market. What does it mean for the US presence in the Middle East? I agree with the previous speaker that at least psychologically, it means something. If I was in the Middle East today, I would say, look, the United States wanted to leave Europe, but now they are forced to be back in Europe. Maybe the same thing could happen to the Middle East. And in fact, the Middle East has the habit of reminding itself of its existence to each and every US president. Most US presidents want to leave the Middle East, and then they may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in them. So if I was in the Middle East today, I would say, is the US really going to leave? Maybe the next crisis, just like it's happening in Ukraine, the US would be forced to come back. I'm not sure that in terms of weapons procurement, I'm not sure that it's a zero-sum gaming between Russian weapons, Chinese weapons, and US weapons. I mean, Chinese weapons are not tried and tested as much as Russian weapons. So I don't know which countries will want to make that trade-off, but I would be very cautious in assuming that if they no longer buy Russian weapons or less buy Russian weapons, they will buy more Chinese weapons. It's something that I would be cautious about. Finally, very last point about Israel, because the previous speaker also mentioned Israel. My impression is that Israel was ideally placed to be, if not a mediator, at least a facilitator, but that Turkey has taken this role. It's too bad, because it could have been an extraordinary opportunity for Israel for the first time to be truly at the center of a negotiation. Maybe it's a lost opportunity, I don't know. Maybe Mr. Zelensky with this awful speech to the Knesset, maybe he botched it, I don't know. But a very final word for my Israeli friends in particular, because I know that several of you on this call. Make no mistake, increasingly we in Europe and our adversaries in Russia and our friends in Ukraine, we see this as an existential conflict. The stakes are getting higher and higher, not about the physical existence of Europe, of course, but in terms of politics, European politics, the stakes are getting higher and higher. And of course, any sign of support for us from you, from our friends all over the world, including in the Middle East, will be more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tertre. Mr. Yari, I'm going to jump in with you before we get into, this is a question from Aurora Minguez, a well-respected and popular Spanish journalist, because Mr. Tertre was just talking about missed opportunities regarding Israel and how Turkey kind of took that mediation role. In a sense, the question, I'm going to ask the question directly, which Aurora asked, but putting it into some kind of context, I guess Israel is kind of walking a very diplomatic tightrope at the moment. And this leads on to a question that Aurora has. Why Israel didn't condemn sharply up until now the Russian invasion? She only saw information about helping Ukrainian Jews fleeing to Israel. And so Mr. Yari, the question from Aurora is, why hasn't Israel been more condemnatory of the Russians? And does it have its own interest for not being as condemnatory as perhaps some other countries?
Israel has voted at the UN with the US, with the Europeans, against the invasion. And I don't think there is any doubt about where Israel stands. But we have to manage our relations with Russia the way porcupines make love. Very carefully. We have the Russian Air Force in Syria. The Israeli Air Force is mounting hundreds of raids on Iranian military facilities inside Syria. A dogfight between Israeli pilots and Russian pilots is not what we are seeking. And not because Israel doesn't trust its pilots. We don't want the Russians operating their anti-aircraft missile batteries stationed in Syria. So we have to be careful, and the Europeans have to understand it the same way the US does. We are against the invasion. We are supporting not only Jews in Ukraine. And we are taking in refugees, etc. But we have to avoid a confrontation, a military confrontation with the Russians. My own opinion is that at any rate, the Russians do not want such a confrontation. The Russians are quite happy with the damage that Israel is inflicting on the Iranians in Syria. Still, this is a crucial issue for us. We have to play it carefully. As to the remark of the previous speaker about Israel's role mediating between Moscow and Kiev, I think I should be honest to tell you that I don't think our prime minister has the skill and experience or the stature to play such a role. And I commend him on realizing it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Yari.
If I might just add to that, Bennett just put out an announcement that we are shocked by the scene from Bucha, and I will try to get the full message in a minute. He says that we cannot, we are very shocked by the scenes in Bucha. We condemn it in any way. The citizens of Ukraine, we are with you, and we are doing everything we can to assist, just as we speak.
Thank you for that.
Could I ask still something to
Aurora, please,
yeah,
as a follow on, why not?
yeah. With all of my respect to Mr. Yari, I think it's a question of morality, considering that Zelensky is a citizen, a Jewish citizen, considering that there's also a lot of rhetoric about Ukrainians being Nazis or extreme right people. Everybody in the Western world has also lots of interest with the Russians, economic interest, but nevertheless, they condemned very sharply what's happening. I think it's not enough to be part of the countries in the United Nations. You must, let's say, play your own role, especially for those who are thinking in a very anti-Semitic way. If they're going to say, well, Israel is not, well, putting clear his position against Russian invasion. It's a question of morality and also a question of public world opinion, in my modest opinion.
Thank you for that, Aurora. Mr. Yari, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, with all due respect, I'm not sure we are happy to take lessons on morality from Europeans or many others. Israel has taken a stand. We are against this invasion. We don't like all this talk about denazification. etc., etc., etc. Do we have to rush tiny Israel to be at the front of those who are condemning Putin? We can denounce it and take a backseat. And I've explained the reason why. Nobody in Israel likes it. I don't know of support for the Russian invasion in Israel. Just now I saw a poll amongst the Palestinians, 50-50. Supporting Russia, 50 supporting Ukrainians. That's not the case in Israel. We don't have to take the front on every single issue.
Thank you, Mr. Yari. Mr. Tertri, you've been patient. I'm going to come back to Ehud Yari in a minute, but we've got a question from Felix Pope here, which I'm going to read. He says, he calls you Bruno. So Bruno mentioned the Middle East's exposure to Russian Ukrainian wheat. But as I understand it, Israel also imports most of its wheat from Russia, Ukraine. How much of a problem would that be for Israel? And could one expect social political turmoil given, rising prices? Is this likely to bleed into, we spoke briefly about Egypt. Could you see that crisis emerging in Israel as well, that sort of food scarcity or...
No. First of all, let's be clear. It's not about food scarcity. Food is here. It's about food prices.
Right.
I mean, some of you in this virtual room know the situation in Israel, the economic situation in Israel much better than I do. So I would be very cautious. But my short answer would be: Israel is in such a different situation, socially, economically, and financially, that what I've said about Egypt and Libya, which are, from what I understand, the two countries in the region which are the most dependent on Ukrainian and Russian wheat, is not applicable to Israel. Whatever the indirect impact of the Ukraine war economically is in Israel, it's not going to be the same thing. But since I only had a short answer to that question, if I may answer another question that I think I may have more interesting answer to, which is from my colleague Luc de Barochet from Le Point, about how come that Russia has been apparently patient, quote unquote. I don't know if these were loose words, but vis-a-vis Turkey. I think the answer is very simple. Russia is losing so many friends that it cannot afford to lose its half friends, especially those who control the straits of and the exit of the Black Sea. It's as simple as that. That's my short answer. So you get two short answers for the price of one question.
Well, I'm going to try and squeeze in another one, if I may, Monsieur Tertre, before I come back to Mr. Yari. Ehud started off by saying one of the things that was very, very noticeable about this conflict was the poor performance of the Russians. Now, you had said in your opening remarks that Russia wasn't planning on giving up on the Middle East. I'm going to ask a slightly different question. Would the Middle East, given their poor performance, give up on Russia? And what do you think the likelihood is, given the poor performance in Ukraine, of Russian influence in that area, and indeed countries within the sort of Middle East area feeling that they're in any way, they have to answer to Russia?
Yes, I think that the answer to your question, you have to break it down into several sub-questions. First of all, whatever is happening now in Ukraine does not negate, does not neutralize what happened in Syria. And in Syria, the fact is, by using Russian methods and by using tactics which were different from Ukraine, they were able to have some horribly successful victories in the field. So, I mean, it's the same armed forces that perform well, quote unquote, in Syria and perform abysmally, quote unquote, in Ukraine. It's a question of terrain. It's a question of expectations, it's a question of strategy, and it's a question of resistance and counter the resistance that you encounter. So all in all, I think once again that it's not going to, it may affect, because of the future
dear. You seem to have frozen.
Weakening of the Russia as a hard security guarantor, but it does not change the intrinsic performance of Russian bombers and missiles, for instance. So you have to break it down into different issues.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tertre. Pedro Gonzalez from Atalayar, you've been very, very patient. Would you like to ask your question, Pedro? Can you unmute yourself? Pedro, I'll give you another second to unmute yourself. I'm going to ask, I should be able to unmute you.
Okay, is now okay? It's okay.
Ask your question.
Okay, no, well, I was hearing about what you have said concerning the modification in certain way of the Israel position versus Russia, especially after the discovery of the horrible images and the condemnation made by Bennett. So I want to change the cap a little bit and just to ask both the EUDRI and also Tetris, if you think that there will be a fuel of the arms race in the reshaping of the Middle East after or at the same time that the invasion is taking place.
Thank you, Pedro. Mr. Yari, do you want to jump in there? A sort of proliferation and arms race in the Middle East, as I understood the question.
I think, yeah, thank you. I think we have an arms race going for quite a few years now in the Middle East. Just go and see the list of procurement by Egypt. Enormous. And you ask yourself sometimes, what's it all for? Everybody, for example, in the Gulf, is going for 5th generation planes, if they can. They are going for missiles, ballistic missiles, Saudi Arabia with China, etc., etc. So the arms race is already there, independent of what happens between Russia and Ukraine. But if I may, just a word of caution. Yes, I was speaking about the poor performance of the Russian army. And, you know, the fact that they need South Ossetians and Chechens and Syrian mercenaries is not to the credit. But we are still in a situation where this same Russian army may be able to link the forces that came from the Crimea Peninsula with the forces up in the northeast around Kharkiv and down, and encircle something like 40% of the Ukrainian army and tear eastern Ukraine from the rest of the country, which is, by the way, exactly what was prophesied by the late Samuel Huntington when he wrote The Clash of Civilizations. Where was the dividing line? In the middle of the Ukraine, between the Orthodox Ukrainians and the Catholics. And this is how we see the war going. So just a word of caution, the Russians may be still able to get some of what Putin initially planned. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Yehud, that's absolutely not what the political situation of Ukraine is. Sam Huntington was right on many things, but he was absolutely wrong on this. There is not an Eastern Ukraine and a Western Ukraine, a Polish leaning and a Russian leaning. I apologize for being very blunt about this, but this is not the way it's happening. I don't disagree. I've agreed with you on 90% of what you said. This, I believe, is plain wrong. Sorry to jump in, but it makes the exchange more lively.
Don't be sorry. We are here so we can listen and learn so many opinions. Please,
Can I
do
say
elaborate. Do elaborate, and then we'll ask.
No, I mean, I'm sorry, there's not much to elaborate. It's simply not true that there is an Eastern Ukraine and a Western Ukraine, a Polish leaning one and a Western Russian leaning one. I mean, I've been to Ukraine many times, and we all know, because we've all become Ukraine experts, that Russian speakers in Ukraine have now turned, most of them have turned nationalists. And by the way, militarily speaking, I really don't think that the Russians are in a position to connect the forces in the north, which have withdrawn, by the way. The region of Kiev is almost totally liberated with the people in the south. But going back to maybe the issue of the day, I would say concerning the arms racing, and here I fully agree, or almost fully agree with Yehud, there is a bad scenario where we see Russia turned into a de facto rogue state and Iran continuing to be a de facto rogue state in the absence of an agreement. So without an agreement, whether it's good and bad, it's an agreement on the nuclear front, and given the current prospects of how Russia will, of the geostrategic situation of Russia in the coming months and years, there is a bad scenario. We have a de facto alliance between an Iran outside any constraints on its nuclear program, and the Russia eager to have as many friends as possible in the region. I mean, it's a hypothesis, a scenario that I'm putting on the table. I don't know whether Yehud agrees, the participant agrees, but I think it's unfortunately an interesting scenario.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. Number one, thank you for these remarks. Your argument is with the late Huntington, not with me. I'm not saying that Ukraine is divided between pro-Russians and pro-Polish. Huntington just said that the civilizational divide runs through Ukraine, and I'm quoting him. The second point I have to differ is whether the Russians think that they have now enough forces to switch their main effort to encirclement in the east. It's not just me.
Okay, on that I agree. I have no problem with that.
We believe they have enough to try. I'm not going to say they're going to succeed.
Maybe I misunderstood what you said then. Okay, then I agree.
Okay.
It's a pity you agree so easily. It was so interesting. So please do not agree that fast, dear gentlemen. I think, Alex, we have Brian.
Yeah, there's some more questions. I'm just gonna jump straight in. Ehud, and then I'm gonna come back to Bruno with a look at some of the stands, which hopefully you'll be able to help us with. But before that, it's a question from Brian Maguire. Currently in Washington. Brian, thank you for that. He notes, Ehud, that the West has discovered a new strength in deploying sanctions against Russia for breaches of international rules and human rights abuses. Is Israel, or should Israel be concerned that the same approach would be used to alter Israeli settler policy and perceived human rights abuses against Palestinians, i.e., is Israel concerned about the raft of sanctions and the fact that the EU is flexing its sanctions regime in a lot more forthright way? Are Israel looking at that going, well, this could happen to us?
The truthful answer is yes. If sanctions work, then there will be a variety of topics and issues with a variety of countries that people may be tempted or leaning towards exercising sanctions. For me, the question is, so I see a potential problem. The problem for me is, so what do we do? What do we do if we want to try and move forward with the Palestinians? There is not much we can do, because the Palestinians are saying to us, whether they want to understand it in Europe or not, the Palestinians are saying, those of them who are talking to us, it's not all of them, They are saying to us, either we get a runaway statehood for which we pay nothing, or we, the Palestinians, are running away from statehood, presenting you with the danger of a one-state solution. How can we in Israel change this formula? How can I get Mr. Abbas or whoever succeeds him to come to the table with a sensible, reasonable set of demands that can be discussed? I believe that, unfortunately, and I'm a guy who spent all his life, and I'm not young anymore, I'm a guy who spent all his life in the no man's land between Israel and Palestinians. Some of them see me as their historian. I believe that they have taken a silent decision long ago during Arafat's day. And the decision is not to make a compromise.
Can I tackle that question too, very briefly? The question of how much is it applicable to future sanctions against another state, including Israel?
Go ahead.
Yes, my answer is very short and very simple. The answer is no. First of all, Europeans are not discovering sanctions. In the mid-2010s, they've sanctioned heavily, although not as heavily as Russia today. Two countries, one was Russia post-2014, and the other was Iran. So we're not discovering sanctions. We're not as sanction prone as our American friends. You count the number of countries under US sanctions, in particular congressional sanctions, and it's absolutely staggering, but we're not discovering sanctions. And the second argument is very simply that as much as we are interested in the security in the region, and as much as some of our politicians are obsessed with the Palestinian questions, the stakes are extraordinarily different. There's no reason any European country could be tempted to suggest and even less succeed in having major sanctions on Israel because of the Palestinian question. Frankly, I really don't think that this parallel is applicable in any way. This does not mean that no European countries will ever want to sanction Israel. Maybe it will happen. But I'm firmly against the idea that what's happening now in Europe regarding sanctions on Russia means anything for a hypothetical ability and willingness to sanction other countries, including Israel.
Okay.
Thank you. Alex, maybe we go to our northern question we got. We have Conrad. Would you like to unmute yourself, Conrad, please?
Yes, or you can ask it for me. Thanks. First of all, thanks for your presentations and the discussion. It's really interesting. And I was wondering if Ehud could elaborate regarding Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Pakistan, and other countries north and east of Iran. How do you see they react to the invasion of Ukraine and the new realignment against Iran, as you described? Could they be helpful partners for Israel, even more than before?
Thanks, Conrad.
Thank you. I think Pakistan is in turmoil. Some people would say has always been in a turmoil, certainly now. It's not a player in our context. Same goes for Turkmenistan. Azerbaijan is a more complicated case, and I think the Azeris are treating Russia in the same way that we are treating Russia, very carefully. And the Azeris come to the picture in the context of that rivalry I was mentioning before between Iran and Turkey. because if they have new trade corridors in the South Caucasus, that has a significant impact on the Iranians. The Azeris, for example, people may know, were spreading rumors that Armenian military aircraft were participating in the battles in Ukraine. It was denied, but this is the context of how the Azeris operate. They prefer to stay close to the West, to stay close to Turkey, stay close even to Israel, but not to quarrel with the Russians.
Thank you, Mr. Yari.
Can I say a word about this?
Yes, please, Mr. Tefri.
I apologize. I'm switching to audio only because my internet connection appears to be unstable. I'll try to be back on video too in a few minutes. There is a major question looming, which is how much the Ukraine war will impact the Caucasus and Russia's ability and willingness to play the balancing role it has attempted to play in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the past 18 months. It's a very open question at present. I don't have the answer, but it seems to me that when I visited Azerbaijan a year ago, I thought that this was a very delicate balancing act and that the Russian-Turkey entente on the ground was very fragile. And let me put it that way. I can't claim specific expertise on this, but I would add to the regions to be watched in terms of potential future impact of the indirect impact of the war, the South Caucasus and the fragile truce between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Tefri, just while we've got you, question, how can Israel, this is from Harold Hyman via our colleague David Kalfa, how can Israel conciliate US alliance with an attraction to the ruthless Russians who alone can control Bashar al-Assad? Does that question make sense to you? In a sense of how does one find a balance? How does Israel find a balance for sort of closer US, and then, you know, the Russians, Bashar al-Assad has managed to, I guess, keep a lid on Syria and stopping some of the contagion across the Israel border as much as he could, and the Russians have had a role in that. Should that be a concern for Israel, I guess?
Well, let me put it this way. I think that under very stressful conditions over the past 3 to 4 years, Israel has managed to find that balance without too many problems. 2 years ago when I was there, I was wondering, and I kept asking to my Israeli friends, how would you be able to maintain that balance? And Israelis seems able to do it. So, I mean, it's a question to be put to my Israeli friends. But my answer is that I find it rather remarkable that Israel has been able. We already knew the Russians were ruthless. We didn't need the Ukraine war to know that the Russians were ruthless, and Israel has been willing and able to maintain that balance. It's just a statement of fact. So I see no reason why the Ukraine war would radically change Israel's willingness and ability to maintain that balance. But the question is more for my Israeli friends themselves.
Okay, well, before I jump to Mr. Yari on that, just another one, if I may, Monsieur Tefri. We haven't spoken about Lebanon. Lebanon, just yesterday, as I understand it, is effectively now a bankrupt state. Should that be a concern, given Hezbollah's role? Are they likely to capitalize on that with Iranian money? And of course, I would love to hear from Mr. Yari on that as well. But Bruno, your thoughts on Lebanon in particular?
Well, 3 points. Lebanon's ability to go lower and lower in the different stages of hell has been remarkable, and the Lebanese people's ability to survive in the various stages of hell has been remarkable too. So the fact that the state is bankrupt, unfortunately, I don't think it radically alters the perspective. There is an additional question regarding food supply also. I mean, again, like other countries in the region, price of cereals. And there is finally another question on whether or not
maybe we should go
a
to
hard gauge in
please continue. Please continue. We did not hear you for a minute.
I'm sorry. My internet connection is unstable, so I'm switching to audio only. There's an additional sub-question, which is maybe for next time, is whether, I can't believe that Emmanuel Macron, if he was reelected, would no longer care about Lebanon, even though, and maybe because his previous attempts to play a role there were so unsuccessful. So watch this space, but let's wait and see he's reelected, which is by no means certain, by the way.
Ehud, you are smiling.
I'm smiling with pain because President Macron was mentioned. I don't think he was, and I think we are in agreement on that, effective trying to save Lebanon from its politicians. But when we speak about the Lebanon, yes, we have the meltdown. Economic, financial meltdown, an unbelievable amount of corruption. But we are coming to, I mentioned it before, to general parliamentary elections in Lebanon in May. And I'm afraid if the West, France, US, the Saudis, others do not intervene in the right way, we are going to end up with a Hezbollah majority in parliament that would complete the transformation of Lebanon into another client of the Iranian network. I'll share with you that I was calling publicly on my government to do some things that we can do quietly in order to assist the other camp. I don't think the government, this government, is listening to me on that. But there is a lot that can be done in order to ensure that in the Sunni districts of Lebanon, all over the country, a new generation of Sunni candidates will not win against the puppets that are presented now by Hezbollah and its allies.
There is another question for you, Ehud, from Naomi Friedman. Would you like to unmute yourself, please? Naomi, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So the Palestinian decision not to compromise has been linked to Abu Mazen's decision that in his lifetime he will not compromise. But what happens after he goes? Will the Palestinian leaders who replace him still refuse to compromise? And how will the situation with Russia and the Gulf, the rise of the alliance with the Gulf states and their position influence the Palestinians in the future?
What do you want to deal with that one first before we jump to Bruno?
Okay, I believe that in the longer run, the rapprochement between Israel and Arab states, who are basically telling the Palestinians, you no longer have veto power over our relations with Israel, will have an impact on the Palestinians. Unfortunately, looking at the potential successes or strings of successes that can come after Mr. Abbas in the Palestinian Authority, I see none of them being capable or willing to try to opt for a real compromise. At the end of the day, that means at one point, Israel has to start considering some unilateral moves, which are possible, in order to get things moving again. But that's probably not for this discussion.
Thank you. Bruno, would you like to, do you have anything to add there?
Not much, given the depth of expertise that exists in this on this question in this virtual room. I would, however, just say one thing. It still strikes me today that a large part of European public opinion and European politics has failed to acknowledge the importance and the transformative power of the Abraham Accords. That's something that the European diplomats see on the ground, but in Europe itself, it's still something that it still amazes me how much people are missing. It's maybe some kind of cognitive bias, but they're missing the transformative potential of the Abraham Accords. That's all I want to say at this point, given the expertise of other people on the Palestinian issue here.
Well, thank you, Monsieur Tertre, for that, because it brings me on to a next question before I'm going to round things off, unless there are any other questions with another question from Aurora, which I will ask. But specifically on the Abraham Accords, we saw recently the Negev conference. And I'm wondering, Mr. Yari, the Negev conference, it was somewhat overshadowed with the loss of 11 lives in Israel because of the terror attacks. Was that a deliberate Palestinian response to the fact that there was this conference and this sort of rapprochement going on in the Middle East, or are the two completely unrelated? So the sort of Negev summit and the terror attacks, is there any linkage that can be made by the kind of you know, the first time we had some serious Middle Eastern leaders actually on the territory of Israel, and it seemed to have started or seemed to have led to some kind of spike in terror.
Well, I think that the terrorist attacks, like the ones we saw recently, are random. There is no headquarters that organizes it and orchestrates it and times it. It's mostly individual initiatives. I don't think it was linked to the Negev summit. Why Negev summit? Why it was held in the desert? Because some of the Arab foreign ministers did not want to come to Jerusalem. Why wasn't the Palestinian foreign minister invited to join too? That's because of who he is, Mr. Riyad Malki. Otherwise, they would have made an effort to get the Palestinians to attend. I'm not sure they would, but they knew that if they get Mr. Malki, knowing him well, if they get Mr. Malki to attend, it's a ticket for a lot of trouble. So they didn't.
Thank you, Mr. Yari. Mr. Tertre, you brought up the subject of the Abraham Accords. I guess the question is, before we finish on one last question, is what is the likelihood of other countries now sort of joining the Abraham Accords club, given all this upheaval in the Middle East? Can we see any more scope for closer rapprochement from other Middle Eastern or Muslim states to Israel, or do you see all of that sort of on a pause button right now?
Well, looking into the future, I can imagine that several European countries are looking at the transfer of their embassies to Jerusalem in a way which is difficult to separate from their own relation with the countries concerned with the Abraham Accords. I can't say much more than that. I mean, this is a bit beyond my expertise, but I would look at the question of transfer of embassies as one of the parameters which may change in the future in Europe. Okay. All things equal.
And just a supplementary as well, if I may, briefly, you know, with the nuclear accords, I mean, does European reliance on Russian gas and oil and the fact that we have people, people like Ursula von der Leyen saying we've got to reduce our reliance, does that strengthen Iran's hand in any negotiations on the nuclear accord, knowing that they have this leverage in terms of oil?
It does a bit, but it's too late in a sense, because the parameters of the agreement are already there. Had the Ukraine war happened 1 year ago, it may have affected the EU3, or at least some of the EU3's behavior in the negotiation, but that's a bit late because the agreement is already there and will not be reopened. It will be signed, or it won't be signed, but it won't be there. What changes is the European outlook on future scenarios with or without a deal, okay? Without a deal, I mean, Europeans are going to need all the gas they can in the future, in future months. Our reliance on Russian gas cannot be severed completely in a few months. Thankfully, we'll have Qatar. Thankfully, we'll have the United States and others. But you're going to see a massive effort in the coming months to reduce as much for next winter our reliance on Russian gas. This means that, if there is Iranian gas, good. Does this mean we will be? Let me put it this way. The Europeans are not going to reopen the draft nuclear deal just because they need Iranian gas more than they did a year ago. That's the way I would put it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Yari, for you, a last question from Aurora Minguez again. A difficult one, but you've been perfectly honest up until now, and refreshingly so. What would be the best outcome or the best solution for this war for Israel? A Ukrainian victory or a Russian one? Is it a positive, as you opened with, so it kind of finishes off nicely? You said this kind of surprise that everyone had at how poor the Russians have performed. Is that loss of prestige for the Russians a positive for Israel in a diplomatic sense and in a political sense? What would be the best outcome in the months ahead in the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Thank you again, Aurora. I will make two quick points. Number one, Israel certainly supports, officially so, but also the public sentiment. The removal of the Russian troops from Ukraine, the re-establishment of Ukrainian sovereign control over the territory, etc. No question about that. And we don't hurt because Russians' prestige is under decline. The second point is not as important. It's about that. Because of the war, as an unintended consequence, we will be getting, I believe, 100, 200 new immigrants to Israel, both from Ukraine, but even more so from Russia. That's a blessing for us. I just want to give you one example, which people are not aware of. A good number of the stars, I'm working in television, so this is close to my heart. A good number of the top stars, top talents of Russian television, Jewish, or they have a grandfather Jewish, moved to Israel. They are now thinking of starting a Russian language network, which will broadcast to Russia. The numbers of people knocking on the doors now, Russians who believe that the economic situation and political there will be intolerable, Ukrainians who see the trouble there and already left the country or are displaced. That's from an Israeli point of view very important. But as I stress it, this is an unintended consequence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ehud. Aurora, just while you're there, we try and keep an eye on things in real time as well. The Foreign Minister of Israel has just tweeted with regards to what's going on right now in Ukraine. It is impossible to remain indifferent in the face of the horrific images from the city of Bucha near Kiev from after the Russian army left. Intentionally harming a civilian population is a war crime, and I strongly condemn it. So some fairly strong words there from Israel's Foreign Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, unless we have any other questions, I would just invite our two guests just to make a couple of concluding remarks, and then we'll start to draw this to a close. And I'll start with Monsieur Tertre. Monsieur Tertre, if you had a crystal ball and you could look into the summer, how do you see this situation evolving? I know it's a very, very difficult question to ask, but you do have considerable expertise and of having studied conflicts and understanding, like few others, how international relations works. How things look, will be looking in the Middle East, and as a consequence of the Ukraine war?
Look, I don't know, because very simply, the war in Ukraine is far, far, far from being over. There have been turning points. There will be other turning points. So the short answer is I don't know. What I am almost certain of is that comes the summer, maybe the battle for Donbass will be over, or maybe it will just be beginning. It's going to be a long, bloody battle for the Donbass, and I have no idea how long it will last, and who knows where Mr. Putin will be by the summer. So I can't get it. My crystal ball is not working. Just too many things can happen. So I can't give you the consequences for the Middle East overall by the summer. It's too early. I know it's the easy thing to say. It's too early to say. We've tried to sketch for you a number of trends that are already happening and that will happen, but I can't be more specific than that, I'm afraid.
Reminds me of the journalist who asked, I believe it was Mao Zedong, what the effects of the French Revolution were, and he said it's too early to tell.
Much too early. It's still too early, by the way.
So, Mr. Yari, your thoughts?
Yes, I think a lot depends now because of what we have discussed before on the amount of military aid that the West is willing and able to transfer to the Ukrainians. I think this is now the key issue. What are they going to get in order to prevent sort of a semi-Russian success in the East?
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Mr. Yari, thank you for your expertise, for your candor. Likewise to Monsieur Tertre, joining us from Paris. It's wonderful, wonderful as always to have such expertise with us. I would say, dear colleagues, that we do have this entire briefing recorded. We will get that to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, if any of you have any supplementary questions, please contact our media advisors. That's Yossi, David, Katya, Yossi Lemkovitz, of course, and Tal and Shaked Amir in the Israel team, and of course, Toby Borins as well. Any questions that you may have that come to mind, and we'll do our best, our level best, to get them through to both Messrs. Yari and Tertre. In the meantime, we'll watch with interest, and we very much look forward to welcoming you to future briefings. So thank you so much to everyone for your attention, and we'll all be in touch very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you for listening.
Hi, Dal.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.